Welcome back, guys, into Unit 4, Imperialism, of our World History curriculum. And today we're going to apply what we learned in our last video about the causes of imperialism, and we're going to apply those specifically to the continent of Africa and see what's going on there and how imperialism spread and also the effects of that spread. So that's our second topic in our unit, and let's get into it. So, let's assume that Europeans want to spread their religion, which of course was Christianity at this time. To do that, they would have to send missionaries to Africa. And the reason I bring that up is one of the really first big modern focus on Africa from the European perspective comes with this man on your left, Dr. David Livingston. He was a Scottish missionary, and he spent decades traveling across Africa doing missionary work and exploring work and so forth. And then he went missing. He was kind of radio silence. What happened to Dr. David Livingston? Everyone was curious. Did he fall in a lake? Did he get eaten by a crocodile? Like, where is this guy? And so a man named Henry Morton Stanley was hired to go look for him. And he would file reports, and the world would they were kind of on the edge of their seats, watching these reports come in and trying to figure out, okay, will they find Dr. Livingston? And so really a lot of the Western world was focused on Africa in a big way. And, well, they did find him. In fact, there is Henry Morton Stanley on the left finding Dr. Livingston. And Dr. Livingston was greeted by Henry Morton Stanley's famous quote, "Dr. Livingston, I presume," which was supposed to be funny because obviously it's Dr. Livingston. Who else would it be? But again, this is the moment where people across the globe, well, specifically Europe, of course, starts to look at Africa and thinking, maybe there's something we could do here. Maybe there's some, possibility of expanding our influence there. So what's going to happen is there's going to be like this mad dash to gain land in Africa. It's called the Scramble for Africa. And the country that's going to set off, believe it or not, is not Britain or France or Germany. It is our little friend, Belgium. There he is. Little Belgium. What's going on there? Well, Belgium was led at the time by its king, King Leopold II. Leopold II actually hired Henry Morton Stanley, the guy who found Dr. David Livingston, and he had him go into the heart of Africa, this area we call the Congo River Basin. And he basically hired him to kind of negotiate a transfer of land. And by building this huge colony right there in the middle of Africa, it really got the attention of other Europeans, because if a little country like Belgium could take this huge swath of territory off of here, well, watch out. You better get in while you can. And so it sets off this mad dash, this scramble for Africa. The Belgian Congo was a huge chunk of land, something like 30 times the size of Belgium. So just a really, really big piece of land. Also, the Belgians under Leopold II were absolutely brutal to the people living in the heart of Africa, because this wasn't a national colony originally. It was actually it was a personal possession of the king himself, and he was there to make as much money as he could. And again, you can see what I'm talking about. Before the Scramble for Africa, you've got a few European outposts here and there, like up here in Algeria and Congo here, but it was largely devoid of European control. And then by 1913, the year before World War I starts, you can see pretty much everything, with the exception of just a few pieces, are controlled by the Europeans. As I said earlier, the Belgians really did not treat the people of the Congo well. They were being exploited. Their labor was brutally to gain that rubber that was a very valuable resource to make King Leopold II very wealthy. And you can see some of these images here. These are workers who have been punished for, we assume, not working up to the standards the Belgians thought they should be. And as a punishment, they've had their hand cut off as basically a message to others to work hard so that you don't wind up in this position. So again, just brutal treatment the Belgians brought to Africa. All right, well, let's get in now to the actual dividing up of Africa. And if you think from the European perspective, if all these countries are aggressively competing for colonies in Africa, the real danger here, of course, is that a war could break out. And that would not be good for the Europeans. It would not be good for business. And so in 1884, Europeans had this big meeting called the Berlin Conference. And there were ground rules that were drawn up for claiming land in Africa. So if you wanted to claim land in Africa, you had to do X, Y, and Z to make it official for other Europeans to recognize your claim. So basically, we're just taking the map of Africa and we're cutting it up and dividing it up among the Europeans. What is significant is who's not there. The Africans themselves. They get no voice at the Berlin Conference. So their continent is being divided up by outsiders, and they don't really have any input. And the borders that are drawn often turn out to be pretty problematic. They don't take into account traditional cultural boundaries, and so you might have a colony in which two traditional rivals are now together in a colony. That's, of course, going to set up a situation where there's going to be a lot of fighting. Or maybe the colony, two countries, Britain and France or something, end up dividing a group into half. And then so you have this traditional ethnic group cut in half on a map artificially by the Europeans. So there you go. You got the Berlin Conference. There's our buddy Bismarck. We talked about him in our last unit, the guy who helped unify Germany. And there is Bismarck overseeing the division of Africa. So this is a really interesting map. What you see here are modern borders in Africa, many of which go back to the days of colonialism. And then superimposed on that are kind of the ethnic breakdown of groups in Africa. You can see how many small little groups there are and how now they're kind of all being sort of compressed into one colony. Again, totally artificial boundaries. Sometimes they would just use latitude and longitude and just draw a line on the map saying, that's ours, and not really taking into account what's the reality on the ground. So 1914 is the year World War I is going to begin, and you can see pretty much everything with just a few exceptions like Liberia, South Africa, and Ethiopia are controlled by outside powers, that is to say, Europeans. All right, well, let's now look at Europeans having to deal with African resistance and what success or lack thereof the Africans have. Now, as a preview, obviously, just by looking at the map, we know the Africans are not going to be successful in kicking the Europeans out in the 1800s. And what's keeping them back, of course, well, technology generally. So let's look at a couple of examples of the Africans trying to fight back unsuccessfully. So the first we're going to look at is 1879, a group called the Zulus in southern Africa, a group that had been very successful in wars against other African groups in its own history, fights a series of wars against the British, but in the end they're not able to maintain their independence. And we just keep coming back to it. It sounds like a broken record, I know, but it's really technology-based. The Africans just don't have the firepower that the British do in this particular case. A great example of this would be a battle called the Battle of Rorke's Drift, which took place in January of 1879. This little British outpost was surrounded by thousands of Zulu warriors. There were only 150 troops, but the British held off that attack because of their firepower. So it shows you just a small number can hold out against a vast number of poorly armed attackers. All right, speaking of the British guys, let's go to West Africa now, and a group called the Ashanti. They are going to fight a series of wars against the British, but again, same point, unsuccessful in the end, and they have not much of a choice, and they're forced to become a British colony. Now, on the non-British side of things, we've got a German example now. So the Germans had a territory called German East Africa. And in the early 1900s, a big rebellion called the Maji Rebellion took place. The story goes that there was an African holy man who believed that this water, this mystical, magical water called Maji, if it were sprinkled on African warriors, that when the Germans fired, that their bullets would simply turn into water, and they basically would make the Africans bulletproof. Well, it turns out that's not the case, and this is a very lopsided war, as you can see, and the African rebels are unsuccessful. So if you were a leader in Africa and you wanted to defeat European powers, you really don't have any other choice other than to modernize. And a great example of this would be Menelik II of Ethiopia. So Ethiopia had kind of a crash course of modernization, buying modern weapons and getting training from Europeans and how to use them. And so, in 1896, when Ethiopia was invaded by Italians, the Italians were very confident they could win, but Menelik II knows he's got an ace up his sleeve. He's got the weapons to match the Europeans. And in fact, at this battle, the Battle of Adowa, you can see that the two armies are matched very evenly, right? They both have rifles, they both have machine guns and cannons, and the Italians are going to lose this battle, and this will give the Ethiopians basically a chance to kind of catch their breath and develop, and it will also allow them to maintain independence, one of the few countries in Africa to do so. Now, this battle was humiliating for the Italians, and when we get to the 1930s, we're going to see that the dictator of Italy then, Mussolini was his name, is going to want to get revenge for that, and he'll attack Ethiopia just a little bit before World War II breaks out. So there's Italy being defeated by the Ethiopians. All right, guys, so in this section we covered what happened in the Congo that set off the Scramble for Africa. We looked at the Berlin Conference where Africa was divided up among the European powers. We looked at examples of resisting against the Europeans, most of which were unsuccessful, but you did have the success of the Ethiopians to point to as sort of what could have been, perhaps, had Africa been a little bit more technologically advanced. All right, so that's it for Africa. In our next video, guys, we're going to go to Asia and talk a little bit about India, see what's going on there in terms of imperialism.